At 1:41 a.m., Nico Valenti's phone lit up with a message from the one person in his organization who never contacted him after midnight unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. Cancel Doc 14. Your signature is fake. A second message appeared. Do not call the office. Then nothing. Nico dialed Mara Ellis directly. One ring, two. On the third, she answered without speaking. Mara. Her breath came fast through the receiver. Someone's outside my apartment. His feet hit the floor. Lock yourself in the bedroom. They're already inside. A dull impact sounded through the phone. Wood splintered. Nico grabbed the pistol from his nightstand. What do they want? Mara whispered so softly he almost missed it. Not money. Another crash. They're looking for the audit. The line went dead. 6 hours earlier, Mara Ellis had been alone under the fluorescent lights of Valenti Maritime's compliance floor, surrounded by shipping records nobody else wanted to read. That was why she was good at her job. Mara did not intimidate people or demand attention. She noticed things. A missing zero, a customs fee paid from the wrong subsidiary, a signature placed where it technically belonged, but not where Nico Valenti would ever put it. Her father used to tell her fraud rarely lived in big lies. Big lies attracted attention. Fraud lived in details people were too bored to question. He had learned that lesson too late. Mara had built her career around never making the same mistake. That night, 17 manifests had bothered her. The cargo looked legitimate. Machine parts, industrial adhesives, refrigeration components. The approvals did not. Every document carried Nico Valenti's executive authorization. Mara had spent 3 years building the exception control system that routed high-risk shipments through executive review. She knew his approval habits better than most people knew their own handwriting. These 17 were wrong. She took a red grease pencil from beside her monitor and circled the first authorization. Then another. Then another. She checked Nico's calendar. One approval had been entered while he was speaking at a charity dinner. Another while his phone was inside a federal courthouse security locker. A third while he was on a plane over the Atlantic. Impossible. Someone was not merely imitating his signature. Someone had access to the machinery beneath it. Mara copied the records to an encrypted drive, printed one manifest, and sent Nico the warning. Then the security feed outside her apartment went black. 23 minutes later, Nico's car stopped hard beside the alley behind Mara's building. Leo Santoro pulled in behind him with 2 men. The front unit's been breached, Leo said. Cameras are looped. Professionals. Nico pushed through the service entrance. On the 3rd floor landing, something moved. He raised his weapon. Don't shoot! Mara stepped from behind a utility cabinet. For 1 second, neither spoke. She wore office trousers, a white blouse under a gray coat, and 1 shoe. The other foot was bare. A thin cut crossed her temple, blood dried into the hair above her ear. In one hand, she held a folded manifest. In the other was the red grease pencil. Nico lowered the gun. Where are they? Apartment, maybe 2. I didn't stay to count. You're hurt. I'm functional. Mara, I'm functional, Nico. The use of his first name landed harder than the blood. Leo sent his men upward. Nico moved closer. What happened? They killed the hall camera, forced the deadbolt, and went straight to my office. How do you know? They ignored the jewelry and the cash. Her voice cracked slightly. They took my laptop. The encrypted drive was attached. Nico's eyes hardened. You copied the files. Yes. Anywhere else? No. Leo returned from above. Apartment's empty. Fire escape window is open. Nico looked at the paper in Mara's hand. You saved one. I grabbed it on the way out. Terrified, bleeding, missing a shoe, and still protecting evidence. Something inside Nico shifted. Nico saw the effort it cost her to stay upright. One hand kept drifting toward the cut on her temple before she stopped herself. She was frightened. That much was obvious. What unsettled him was the discipline wrapped around the fear. Mara had spent years making herself indispensable without ever behaving as if she were. Now, someone inside his own structure had noticed exactly how dangerous that made her. He hated that they had noticed before he had admitted it. Tell me. Mara unfolded the manifest. 17 shipments carrying your authorization. None were authorized by you. You're certain? I checked your physical location against every timestamp. Leo frowned. How many people could fake that credential? Fake the visible signature? Hundreds. Mara tapped the authorization block. Generated inside the system without creating an exception alert? A beat. 6. The stairwell went quiet. Nico's men had spent years protecting him from threats outside the organization. Mara had just told him the danger was already inside. He took the manifest. Can you walk? She looked at her bare foot. I've had better nights. That wasn't the question. Yes. Good. You're coming with me. Where? Somewhere nobody on that list of 6 knows to look. I need access to the system. You need to stay alive. And you need to know what those shipments are carrying. Nico stepped closer. We solve both problems, in that order. The Valenti Social Club had been closed to the public for 11 years. To the neighborhood, it was a relic. Dark brick, frosted windows, a faded brass plaque beside a door that never seemed to open. The second floor was not a relic. The old club belonged to another era of the Valenti family, a place Nico's father had once used for Sunday dinners and private negotiations. Nico had kept it because nobody important considered it important anymore. No corporate badges, no cloud-connected cameras, no employee directory showing who had access. For the first time since leaving her apartment, Mara's shoulders lowered a fraction. Then she noticed the reinforced locks, reinforced doors, independent communications, a medical room, 2 bedrooms, no connection to Valenti Maritime's corporate security network. Mara stood in the command room wearing borrowed socks and staring at 3 blank monitors. You're going to lock me here. I'm going to keep you alive. That sounded better in your head. Nico ignored the comment. Leo, 2 men downstairs. Nobody enters without my approval. Mara flattened the surviving manifest on the table. If someone inside the company forged your authorization, the safest place for me is not necessarily the place farthest from the system. It is tonight. You don't know that. I know somebody just broke into your apartment. And I know why. That stopped him. Mara picked up the red pencil. Whoever did this believed my laptop was the threat. It was. No, she pointed to the timestamp. This is. Nico leaned over the page. All 17 approvals look perfect until you compare the transaction clock with the validation clock. She circled 2 strings of numbers. One says you approved this at 11:16:42. The authentication service records the credential at 11:18:12. Leo frowned. So? 90 seconds. Mara looked up. Exactly. Every false approval is delayed by 90 seconds, not 89, not 91. Nico's gaze sharpened. A system clock. Or a mirrored credential running through a machine whose synchronization is wrong. Until that moment, they had a betrayal and 17 suspicious shipments. Now they had a fingerprint. "Give me the internal server logs," Mara said, "and I can trace which executive terminal is producing that offset." Leo's phone vibrated. He answered, listened, then looked at Nico. The cleanup team reached Mara's apartment. "What did they find?" "Nothing." Mara frowned. "They wiped it. Hard drives gone. Paper files gone. They even took the broken lock." Mara went still. They weren't cleaning up after themselves. She looked at the one manifest beneath her hand. They were cleaning up me. Nico's eyes dropped to the red circle around the timestamp, then back to her. "No." His voice was quiet. "They tried." For the next 10 seconds, nobody in the command room moved. Then Mara held out her hand. "Internal server access." Nico didn't reach for the keyboard. "No." Her expression barely changed, but the silence sharpened. "You just heard Leo. Someone professionally erased my apartment because they believed I could identify them. Which is exactly why you're staying off the network. If I stay off the network, we learn nothing. We learn whether someone comes looking for you." Mara stared at him. "So your plan is to keep me in a locked room and wait? My plan is to keep you alive long enough to have another argument tomorrow. That is not a plan. That is containment." Leo glanced between them and wisely found something fascinating on his phone. Nico folded his arms. "The company network logs every active connection. The second your credentials appear, whoever did this knows you survived, with access to the evidence. I know how the network works. I helped design the exception layer. Then you understand the risk. I understand that you're treating access like a gun and assuming I don't know how to hold it." Nico's jaw went still. Mara pressed one hand against the edge of the table. She was exhausted. He could see it in the way she favored one side and blinked too slowly. But her voice remained precise. "My father lost everything because men above him controlled the information and told him they were protecting the company. By the time he realized what they had signed in his name, the decision had already been made for him." Nico's expression hardened for a different reason. "This is not your father's case." "No, but you are making the same mistake." Leo stopped pretending not to listen. Mara pointed to the manifest. "You want to protect me? Fine. Give me a clean terminal with no employee credentials. Mirror the logs locally. Isolate the connection. But do not remove the one thing I can actually contribute and call that protection." Nico looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to Leo. "Build the mirror." Mara exhaled once. It was the closest thing to victory she allowed herself. 20 minutes later, a stripped-down workstation hummed to life. No external messaging, no corporate login attached to Mara, only a live copy of the authorization logs, routed through a secured bridge Leo's people controlled. Mara sat in front of the screen. "Pull every executive terminal with authentication drift above 30 seconds. Leo did. 21 results appeared. "Now isolate recurring offsets." The list dropped to 4. Mara leaned closer. 90 seconds. One line remained. Executive Terminal E7. Leo read the assignment field. Samuel Grady. Nico said nothing. Samuel Grady had been Valenti Maritime's chief operating officer for 9 years. He had survived federal subpoenas, labor strikes, 3 acquisitions, and 2 internal restructurings without once creating a problem Nico had to solve twice. He was disciplined, useful, trusted. Mara studied the log again. "This is not enough." Leo looked surprised. "You just traced the fake approvals to Grady's terminal." I traced the clock drift to his terminal. That does not prove he generated the authorizations. Nico's eyes shifted to her. What would? A reaction. Mara turned in the chair. We seed a query into the internal audit queue. Something harmless, but specific enough that only whoever is monitoring these shipments will understand what it means. Leo frowned. And then? We watch what they touch. Nico was already thinking through the consequences. If Grady is innocent, we tip him off that we're suspicious. If he's innocent, he'll forward the query to legal and ask why compliance is reviewing archived manifests. And if he's guilty? Mara's eyes returned to the screen. He'll try to erase the past before we can reconstruct it. Nico looked at Leo. Set it up. This time he did not overrule her. That mattered more than Mara expected. She drafted the audit notice herself, routine historical verification triggered by timestamp inconsistency. No mention of forged signatures, no mention of Doc 14, no mention of her. They inserted it into the audit queue at 3:12 a.m. For 4 minutes, nothing happened. Nico stood behind her, silent. Leo monitored network traffic from the opposite console. Mara watched the screen without blinking. At 3:17, an archived manifest disappeared. Then a second. Then a third. Leo swore under his breath. Mara's pulse kicked hard. Freeze the deletion process. I can't, Leo said. Whoever is doing it has executive override. Don't stop them. Nico's voice cut across the room. Mara looked back. He had understood. Let them show us what scares them. She turned to the screen again. 3 records vanished. Then the deletions stopped. Mara opened the archival index and pulled the metadata stubs left behind. Dates, container numbers, origin ports, destination entities. Nico leaned over her shoulder. Those companies mean something to you. She had gone completely still. I've seen them before. Where? I don't know. Mara opened a secondary search. Her fingers moved faster now, not panicked, hunting. The first company had been dissolved 7 years earlier. The second was registered through a legal services office in Delaware. The third connected to a holding corporation with no employees and no physical address. Then Mara found an old regulatory filing. Her face changed. Nico noticed before Leo did. What? She did not answer. She pulled another record. Then another. The names aligned across the screen. Ridgeway Consulting, North Harbor Holdings, Calder Strategic Logistics. Mara's hand left the mouse. My father. Nico moved closer. What about him? These companies were in his case. The room seemed to contract. Mara opened a public archive from 8 years earlier. Her father, Daniel Ellis, had been the controller of a regional manufacturing company accused of hiding nearly $12 million in fraudulent transfers. He had insisted the transactions were structured above him. Nobody believed him. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges after the company threatened to pursue his subordinates. He died 2 years later with his reputation destroyed. Mara clicked through the old filing until she found the consulting appendix. There it was. Ridgeway Consulting had advised the company during the restructuring period when the false transfers occurred. Leo leaned toward the screen. Who owned Ridgeway? Mara scrolled. Her breath stopped. Samuel Grady. Nico's face became unreadable. That could still be coincidence. Mara shook her head. No. She opened the current ghost shipment records beside the old fraud structure. The same sequence repeated across both. Operating company. Temporary intermediary. Dormant shell. Asset transfer. Different names. Same architecture. He's done this before. Her voice was quiet now, not frightened, cold. Nico looked at the screen, then at her. For money? At first I thought so. Mara pulled up the 17 false manifests. Look at the cargo classifications. Look at the routing. Look at whose authorization is attached to every one. Mine. Yes. She opened an internal risk model. If federal agents intercept 2 or 3 of these shipments, they don't see a rogue employee moving contraband through your company. She clicked a final field. They see a documented pattern personally approved by Nico Valenti. Leo's expression changed. He's not stealing from us. No. Mara looked directly at Nico. He's building a case against you. The silence that followed was heavier than the one after the apartment attack. Nico had spent years believing he survived because he saw betrayal before it arrived. Tonight, Mara had shown him a betrayal that had been operating inside his own walls, using his systems, his authority, and his reputation as weapons. And she had done it while barefoot, bleeding, and locked inside a building she had never seen before. For the first time that night, Nico stopped thinking of Mara as someone he needed to protect. He looked at her as the only person in the room who could see the whole board. What happens next? He asked. Not an order, a question. Mara turned back to the screen. We find out what Samuel Grady plans to do after you fall. Mara did not answer immediately. She closed the old regulatory archive and leaned back in the chair. For the first time since Nico found her in the stairwell, exhaustion seemed to reach her all at once. The adrenaline had carried her through the attack, the erased apartment, and hours of tracing fraudulent manifests. Now her hands were beginning to shake. Nico noticed. Enough. Mara looked up. We just learned Grady is building a federal case around you. And you've been awake for almost 24 hours. So have you. I'm not the one who had a door kicked in 3 feet from my face. He expected an argument. Instead, Mara looked away. That worried him more. Leo had gone downstairs to coordinate a security rotation, leaving the command floor unusually quiet. The old social club creaked around them, pipes ticking behind the walls as the building cooled. Nico poured water into a glass and set it beside her. Mara stared at it. My father used to sit at our kitchen table like this. Nico remained standing. Like what? Trying to prove something everyone had already decided wasn't true. She rubbed her thumb over the red grease pencil. When the investigation started, his company told him not to worry. They said senior management would handle it. They took his files, restricted his access, told him staying out of the process was for his own protection. Her mouth tightened. 3 weeks later, those same people told prosecutors the transactions had originated from his department. Nico said nothing. He kept saying there were records that would prove he hadn't structured the transfers, but by then he couldn't get near the system. Mara finally looked at him. So, when you tell me to stay safe while everyone else handles the dangerous part, I don't hear protection. What do you hear? A locked door. The answer landed exactly where she intended. Nico pulled out the chair opposite her and sat. My mother was killed when I was 16. Mara went still. He had never told her that. Not in 3 years. Not even indirectly. My father knew someone had been watching our house, Nico continued. He knew a rival crew was asking questions about our routine. He decided changing security would make him look afraid. His voice remained even. They fired through her car window outside a grocery store. Mara's eyes softened. Nico. He spent the rest of his life calling it bad luck. Nico looked at the blank monitor between them. I learned something different. That you control everything before it can hurt you. Yes. Mara understood then that his control was not arrogance alone. It was grief turned into procedure. Schedules, guards, backup routes, compartmentalized information, walls. You can reduce risk, she said quietly. You can't eliminate choice. Nico looked at her. There was no accusation in her tone now. That somehow made it harder to ignore. After a moment he said, Grady had access to more than shipping. Mara straightened slightly. How much more? Real estate holdings, insurance structures, secondary financing on 3 port properties. Her fatigue vanished. Why didn't you tell me that before? Because until tonight, it wasn't relevant. It's relevant now. She turned back to the terminal. Show me everything he could influence. Nico hesitated only once. Then he entered his private credentials. That single action would have been meaningless to anyone else. Mara understood exactly what it cost him. For the next hour, they reconstructed Samuel Grady's position inside Valenti Maritime. The pattern appeared slowly. Loans secured against port facilities. Insurance policies updated months earlier. Quiet transfers of minority ownership into holding companies. Proxy investors buying distressed debt connected to Valenti properties. Mara opened the corporate registry for one of the investors, then another. Her expression changed. Nico. He stepped behind her. What? These companies aren't random creditors. She traced the ownership chain. They're positioned to buy your assets if Valenti Maritime gets seized or forced into restructuring. Leo had returned and now stood beside the doorway. You're saying Grady wants the company? Not exactly. Mara pulled up the false shipping records. He wants the government to break the company for him. The pieces aligned. Grady manufactures illegal shipments under Nico's authorization. Authorities intercept them. Federal prosecutors establish a documented pattern. Accounts freeze. Lenders panic. Valenti Maritime becomes toxic. While Nico fights criminal charges, proxy companies acquire the legitimate infrastructure at distressed prices. Leo stared at the screen. That takes years to build. It has taken years, Mara said. Nico's gaze hardened. And the attack on you? I accelerated his timetable. She opened the upcoming freight schedule. If my audit exposed the cloned authorizations before one of these shipments was intercepted, the entire frame collapses. Her fingers stopped. There was one shipment highlighted for the following night. Dock 14, the same shipment she had warned Nico to cancel. Mara opened the container metadata. Its contents had been changed twice in 48 hours. No final customs declaration, no verified consignee, no external insurance certificate. It's the trigger, she said. Nico leaned closer. The shipment that makes the case. Yes. And it leaves tomorrow night. Mara nodded. Which means Grady is almost finished. Nico's decision came instantly. You're done. She turned. What? You've given me enough. No, I've given you the shape of the plan. We still need the authorization chain. My people can get it. Your people didn't notice 17 forged manifests. Nico's expression closed. Mara. She recognized the tone. Not discussion. Command. He crossed to the terminal and removed a small hardware key from the security port. The mirrored audit environment went black. Mara stared at the screen. What did you just do? Removed your access. The room changed. Not loudly. No shouting. No slammed furniture. Something colder happened. The trust between them simply stopped breathing. Give it back. No. Nico, Grady already sent men into your apartment. If he realizes you can reconstruct the frame, he won't make the same mistake twice. So your answer is to make me useless. My answer is to make you alive. Mara stood. You told me about your mother 10 minutes ago, and somehow you still learned the wrong lesson. His face hardened. Careful. No. She stepped closer. You don't get to show me the wound underneath all this control and then use it as permission to control me. I'm trying to keep you from getting killed. And I am telling you what it costs. This isn't negotiable. Mara actually laughed once. There was no humor in it. That's exactly what they told my father. Nico froze. She pointed at the dead monitor. They took away his access. They made the decisions. They told him professionals would handle it. Mara, this is different. It always sounds different to the man holding the key. Leo looked down. Nico's voice dropped. You are not going back into that system. Then we're done. The words struck harder than either expected. Mara walked away from the table. Nico caught her wrist, not violently, but enough. She looked at his hand, then at him. He released her immediately. For 1 second, regret crossed his face. Mara saw it. It did not repair anything. I trusted you, she said, past tense. Nico's eyes shifted. Mara, you trusted me when my answer matched what you wanted. She backed toward the hallway. That isn't trust. Then she left him standing beside the black monitor. Nico did not follow. Maybe because he knew she was right. Maybe because control was easier than admitting fear. Hours later, Mara sat alone in one of the upstairs bedrooms with the surviving manifest spread across her knees. She no longer had server access. No mirrored logs, no security key, only paper, and the red grease pencil. She stared at the 90-second discrepancy until another detail surfaced. The false approvals did not merely carry Nico's credential. Each one required an exception validation handshake before release, a process Mara herself had designed. And there was one feature Nico had forgotten, a dormant emergency audit challenge. It could not retrieve records. It could not expose archived data. But if activated against a specific shipment, it would force the person holding the cloned credential to validate it again, live, from whatever terminal they were using. Mara looked toward the locked command room downstairs. Nico had taken away her access to his system. He had not taken away her knowledge of the system. She picked up the grease pencil and circled Doc 14. There was still one way to make Samuel Grady expose himself. And this time, Mara would not ask permission. At 6:10 the next evening, Mara walked back into the command room. Nico was standing over a map of the port with Leo when he saw her. His eyes dropped immediately to the red grease pencil in her hand. What did you do? Mara placed the Doc 14 manifest on the table. I built an emergency validation challenge into the exception system 2 years ago. It was designed for exactly one scenario: suspected credential cloning. Nico's expression changed. You can still trigger it? Without full access, yes. And what happens? The cloned credential holder gets a private notice that federal inspectors have flagged the shipment. To clear it, they have to re-authenticate from the active terminal. Leo understood first, which gives us the machine. And the user sitting in front of it, Mara said. Nico looked at her for a long moment. Then his gaze shifted to the security key in his hand. Old instinct told him to end the conversation. Take the pencil, lock the terminal, put Mara behind 3 armed men, and solve the rest without her. Mara watched him make the choice. Finally, Nico placed the key on the table between them. "Tell me the plan." She did. At 8:47 p.m., Dock 14 appeared almost empty. Rain had left the concrete black and reflective beneath the cargo lights. A single container sat on the loading lane, its customs seal intact. Mara watched from a secured operations room 300 yards away. Nico stood beside her, not behind her. That distinction mattered. Leo's teams had already isolated the surrounding access roads. Port security had been quietly replaced with Valenti men. Nobody moved unless Mara's signal said they could. She activated the challenge. A warning appeared on the internal freight network. Federal exception review pending. Revalidate executive authorized to prevent seizure. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Mara's hand hovered over the keyboard. At 83 seconds, a terminal answered. Executive Terminal E7. But it was not inside Valenti Maritime Headquarters. The location ping came from the private freight control center across the river. "Grady moved the terminal," Mara said. A second alert appeared. Authorization accepted. Then the Dock 14 shipment changed destination. Not cancelled, redirected. "He's trying to move the evidence," Leo said. Mara traced the route. "South Freight Yard. That's outside normal customs coverage." Nico reached for his radio. Mara caught his wrist. "Wait." He looked at her. "If you move now, Grady can argue someone else used the credential." "What do you need?" His voice, his decision, something tying him personally to the reroute. Every instinct in Nico's body resisted the delay. Mara saw it. He looked toward the live map, then back at her, and waited. 3 minutes later, an internal call opened between Terminal E7 and the dock supervisor. Grady's voice came through the recorded channel. "Move 14 now. No inspection, no questions." Valenti approved it. Mara pressed record. Nico's face went cold. "That enough?" "That's enough." This time she released his wrist. "Go." The freight control center was secured in 11 minutes. Grady never made it to the rear exit. By the time Mara and Nico arrived, Leo had him seated in a glass-walled conference room with his hands visible on the table. Grady looked at Mara first, not Nico. "You should have died in that apartment." Nico moved. Mara stepped in front of him. "No." One word. Nico stopped. Grady laughed weakly. "There. That's your problem, Valenti. You let employees believe they matter." Mara placed the surviving manifest in front of him. "My father mattered too." For the first time, Grady's expression slipped. "Daniel Ellis." He remembered the name. Mara saw it. "You used Ridgeway Consulting to structure the transfers," she said. "Then you let him take the blame." Grady leaned back. "He signed what was put in front of him. He trusted the people above him. That was his mistake." Nico's hand curled at his side. Mara kept her eyes on Grady. "And mine was thinking this started with me." She set a small recorder beside the manifest. "But you repeated the same structure, same shell sequence, same validation pattern, same timing logic." Grady's smile disappeared. "The difference is that my father had no one willing to listen before the records vanished." She glanced at Nico. "I do." Grady looked between them and realized, too late, what had changed. Nico was not speaking for Mara. He was letting her finish. Leo entered carrying a sealed evidence drive. "We pulled the full credential history, original machine, reroutes, deleted archives, proxy ownership, everything." Mara exhaled. For 8 years, her father's guilt had existed because the people who controlled the evidence also controlled the story. Not anymore. Nico looked at Grady. "You wanted my company." Grady said nothing. "You built criminal shipments under my authority, planned the seizure, then positioned your proxies to buy what was left." Silence. Nico leaned closer. "You should have understood one thing before you built a plan around Mara Ellis." Grady swallowed. "She checks the details." By sunrise, the Dock 14 shipment was in federal custody under evidence provided anonymously through Valenti Maritime's outside counsel. The forged authorization chain was preserved. Grady's proxy companies were exposed before they could acquire a single asset. And buried inside the recovered Ridgway records was something Mara had stopped believing she would ever see: a signed directive assigning the original fraudulent transfers to Samuel Grady's consulting team. Daniel Ellis had not designed the scheme. He had been selected to carry it. 3 weeks later, Mara stood outside a small courthouse holding a corrected public filing that formally identified her father as a manipulated subordinate rather than the architect of the fraud. There was no celebration, no speech. She simply read his name without the word mastermind beside it. For years, she had imagined vindication as something loud enough to repair the past. It wasn't. The courthouse steps stayed crowded, traffic kept moving. Her father was still gone, but the lie that had survived him was finally gone too. Mara folded the filing carefully. Then she closed her eyes. Nico waited several steps away. He did not tell her what she should feel. He did not move closer because he thought grief required fixing. He waited. Only when Mara reached for his hand did he take it. 6 weeks later, Mara entered the office beside Nico's and found a contract waiting on her desk. Valenti Risk and Intelligence, Independent Reporting Authority, Independent Audit Access, no executive override without written review. Mara read every line. Nico leaned against the doorway. "You're staring at page 4. It's badly written. It cost me $1,200 an hour. You were robbed." She opened a drawer and pulled out the red grease pencil. The same one she had carried out of her apartment the night someone tried to erase her. She circled a clause. Nico walked closer. Months earlier, he would have told her what the document meant, what she should do, why his decision was safer. Instead, he looked at the red mark, then at her. "Is this what you want?" Mara crossed out 3 words, rewrote the clause, and signed beneath it. "Now it is." Nico smiled. Not because she had agreed with him, because she had chosen. The first time Mara used that pencil, it proved his signature was fake. This time, it marked the agreement neither of them had been forced to make. And in Nico Valenti's world, that made it the most binding contract he had ever signed. Would you have trusted Mara's plan after the attack? Or would you have made Nico's mistake and tried to protect her by taking away her choice? If you want more Mafia Boss stories where trust has to be earned, subscribe and stay for the next one.